When you hear the name George Romero, I'm sure you immediately think of the word zombies. And that's no surprise. For Romero, zombies helped him break into feature films, and zombies were ultimately the idea that defined his career. But the works of Romero go far beyond the undead. And outside of his Living Dead films, one of Romero's most socially conscious and disturbing movies that reflects many ideas also explored in his zombie films is his 1973 outbreak parable, The Crazies. Much like Night, Dawn, and Day, The Crazies sees a potentially world-ending crisis throw a small community into chaos. Only here, it's a government spill of a bioweapon known as Trixie. But while this has always been a lesser-known work of Romero's compared to his undead horrors, it reflects a lot of the same ideas you find in those zombie movies, except it has even more of the social anxieties of the time that I feel continue to resonate and make this a really fascinating watch a half a century later. Combine that with an awesome remake that pushed the original's limitations into a much larger and more bombastic battle, and you have two visions of government-made crises and the people caught within the chaos. So join me as we explore George Romero's The Crazies, a paranoid piece of Contagion horror. Now, if you're talking about the works of George Romero, you're ultimately going to talk about Night of the Living Dead, so let's just get that out of the way right here. You already know the story. 1968 zombie movie made on a super cheap budget and designed to get Romero and his pals out of industrial filmmaking. Cue a copyright mistake that throws it into the public domain immediately, and you get Romero and the rest of his group trying to work with no budget and no respect for the next 40 years. You wouldn't be able to tell just by looking at his filmography, but George Romero never intended to be defined as a horror director. Night of the Living Dead was made as a way to get him and his crew out of only being industrial filmmakers for hire and into making feature films. But its success also meant that studios mostly wanted him to make horror. Romero soon found out the hard way with his second feature film, There's Always Vanilla, in 1971. It's a low-key romantic comedy, and it really went nowhere at the box office. Romero himself called it his worst movie. In response, the director quickly returned to horror with Season of the Witch in 1972, about a housewife who embraces witchcraft, which also did very poorly in theaters. And so, in search of a hit, that led Romero to our main subject, The Crazies, which first hit theaters on March 16, 1973. In the lead-up to the film, Romero and his co-heads of production company The Latent Image, John Russo and Russell Streiner, were coming apart at the seams due to their continued financial losses. So Romero enlisted the help of producer Al Croft, who brought in screenwriter Paul McCullough and his screenplay, The Mad People, a story about a small town infected by a bacterial weapon and the military attempting to quarantine it. But according to Romero, the script just didn't quite work, with the director saying, Paul's story was an exploration of people's behavior after they were affected not only by the chemical, but also by the madness and chaos of the situation. But without any interested producers, Romero found financing from an unlikely source, a softcore porn producer by the name of Lee Hessel, who was looking to use Romero to get into the more legit side of the film industry. Seeing Romero as his ticket, Hessel agreed to finance the film on one condition. Romero would need to rewrite McCullough's script to make it less heady and more visceral.
Something that brutalizes. It's madness unleashed by human error. The Crazies.
The resulting film was The Crazies, set and actually filmed in the real town of Evans City, Pennsylvania, just outside of, you guessed it, Pittsburgh. And by the time the film starts, a US Army plane has already crashed into a nearby river, releasing an experimental biological weapon known as Trixie into the town's water supply and infecting the population. And shortly after the symptoms begin, illustrated by the film opening with a father in the process of burning his house down with his family inside, the military quarantines the area, attempting to stop the spread while they desperately search for a cure. The effects of the weapon? Well, craziness, with the infected quietly losing their minds before erupting into chaos and violence. In the midst of this, Romero's focus is on firefighter David, Will McMillan, his pregnant fiancée Judy, Lane Carroll, and David's longtime friend Clank, Harold Wayne Jones. All the stars are here, who go on the run to avoid being captured by the military, never really knowing why exactly the quarantine and attacks have happened. On the other end, Dr. Watts, Richard France, who you may know best as the guy yelling on TV in Dawn of the Dead, is attempting to create a cure, while Colonel Peckham, Lloyd Haller, attempts to control the situation as it spirals out of control. And overall, I think that Romero's movie is sort of lacking when it comes to execution, but the ideas and commentary it has on the geopolitical state of the US are really effective. If you look at Night of the Living Dead, made just 5 years earlier, you can see how Romero has really embraced social commentary to the point of making it very clear and just as important as anything else in the film. Romero would always say that his commentary on racial tensions in Night were simply a byproduct of casting Dwayne Jones as his lead, but in The Crazies, there's no mistaking that Romero is explicitly criticizing the US involvement in the Vietnam War. Specifically, The Crazies draws parallels to the My Lai massacre on March 16, 1968, where US Army soldiers murdered as many as 500 unarmed Vietnamese civilians, including the rape and mutilation of women and children. It's a war crime that was covered up by the Army for more than a year and largely went unpunished. And here, in a story where a military weapon impacts a small town, leading to a cover-up and mass execution of civilians, you can see Romero's outrage. Taking a true story, adding a heightened element with Trixie being a parallel to Agent Orange, and placing it on home soil to shove it in people's faces. According to Romero, at the time I made it, we were still in Vietnam and it was a very heartfelt problem, a part of the national consciousness, and I don't think anyone was ready to see that situation. Even though it's not a Vietnam film, it's an anti-military film. If it surprises you that Romero was against the war in Vietnam and was angry with the direction that the United States was heading in, well then you probably weren't paying attention when watching any of his movies. It's not a coincidence that so many actions and images found throughout The Crazies reflect major real-world social upheaval happening at the time of the film's release. The two civilians that serve as our leads in the town, David and Clank, are Vietnam veterans, and it's their experience that makes them both dangerous and paranoid. The deployment of government soldiers against civilians of their own nation reflect anxieties of military police action and a breaking of the US Constitution. At one point, a pastor who has been hiding civilians self-immolates after his congregation is taken, reflecting Vietnamese Buddhist monk Thi Quang Duc, who did the same in 1963 out of protest against the persecution of Buddhists. The fully infected Kathy's run-in with soldiers recalls the flower power anti-war demonstrations of the 60s. And while it's obvious that the spread of Trixie would be disastrous for the entire world, Romero chooses to make the differences between the infected and uninfected very vague. Aside from a few examples, we're never quite sure who has lost their mind from Trixie infection and who has gone mad from the situation that they've found themselves in. And I think that's one of the strongest aspects of the movie. What difference is there between a population driven mad by their government's weapon and those gone insane from the world the government has put them into? Likewise, how can you trust the government when they're controlled by faceless bureaucrats and their actions are carried out by mask-wearing soldiers ready to shoot and burn at a moment's notice? And really, it's those ideas that are the strongest aspect of Romero's movie, not really the film itself. With a really small budget, The Crazies relies on inexperienced, mostly unknown actors whose abilities range greatly from person to person. The film also relies on existing buildings and nature instead of building sets, which really adds to its realism and immediacy, while limiting what's possible on screen. And in signature Romero style, a lot of the film is shot on unplanned coverage that's edited together in a rapid, chaotic fashion. Romero once said, "I'd rather have 100 lousy shots than one great one," and you can tell, but hey, this shooter's gonna shoot. Romero was never a flashy director. With his background in industrial films, I think that Romero was always a very practical director, and a lot of the horror that he created, especially in the first decade of the movies he made, draws its power from being very matter-of-fact and happening within a realistic environment. The way that the infection and quarantine plays out here feels very believable. First, there's an initial incident, then the government and those in the know start acting before those that are affected really get what's going on, and then then the symptoms of the infection, which was already in place before anything could stop it, go into effect. And that's really what makes this story feel so hopeless. Of course, seeing it all on the other side of the COVID-19 pandemic will put that lens on most people watching it today, but I think that the process that Romero captures here feels very true to life and broadly applicable. I also really like the subtlety of how the virus plays out. Unlike the remake, which I'll get to in a few minutes, Trixie infection doesn't cause people to just suddenly turn into violent monsters. Instead, it's a type of insanity that feels much more realistic. It's paranoia, laughing at tragic incidents, loss of focus, and a complete detachment from reality. Sometimes that turns into violence depending on the person and how they're provoked, but not always. In one of the film's most disturbing moments, the infected Artie at first shows signs through his paranoia and judgment, which then turns into overprotection of his daughter Kathy, and then finally his attempted sexual assault of her. It's this really dark and disturbing moment, but you see where it starts and how it develops through the infection in one specific instance. It's not a one-size-fits-all craziness. The same goes for the rest of our protagonists as the story progresses. Are David and Clank just trying to survive? Is their Vietnam-inflicted PTSD driving them to violence? Or are they actually infected and slowly going mad? Romero chooses to slowly reveal the truth because these characters are left unsure for so long, and I think that makes it all so much more heartbreaking. On the side of the government, both Colonel Peckham and Dr. Watts serve as the human representatives that, while trying to save lives and solve the situation, are dealing with a government that either cannot or will not care about the lives of its civilians. They feel really human, and honestly, I'm much more interested in their characters than in the civilian side, which I think hurts the film. But the Crazies doesn't end with a bang here. Instead, it fizzles out. All hope lost, almost everyone dead and infected aside from the immune David, who mourns the infection and death of Judy, and no resolution for the growing infection. Unfortunately, as is the case with many of Romero's movies, The Crazies did not do very well financially and had a pretty lukewarm critical reception when it was first released. It also had a very 70s way of rolling out its release across the United States, with it being released in different sections of the country slowly over time and released under different titles, including of course The Crazies, as well as codename Trixie. It's sort of like the original A/B testing, trying to figure out which name, which poster, which region, what style of marketing would attract the best crowd. Unfortunately, none of them worked all that well. Making only $143,000, that's right, thousand, against its $275,000 budget, the financial failure of The Crazies put Romero's production company, The Latent Image, out of business and landed Romero in $1 million of debt. Huge now, absolutely massive in the 70s. Eventually, Romero's search for a way forward led to him partnering with Richard Rubinstein and forming a new company, Laurel Enterprises. Today, Rubinstein is notorious for essentially holding the films he made with Romero hostage and refusing to license them out unless he's paid a fortune. But it was their partnership that helped Romero move forward from several big financial losses. In the aftermath, Romero would go on to make some of his most well-loved films, including Martin, as well as his big return to zombies with Dawn of the Dead, which really marked a turning point in his career. Overall, the 80s were the most successful decade for the director, even as he continued to ride a lot of ups and downs while dealing with studios big and small. And while I'd love to keep covering more of Romero's work, including Creepshow and maybe even redoing my Trilogy of the Dead video someday, let's just stick with The Crazies for now. I think the horror community loves an underdog just as much as they love a genius, and just as much as they love a creator who seems to be a genuinely nice and caring person. And by all accounts, Romero was all three. So after the success of Dawn of the Dead and the movies that came afterward, and with Romero's earlier movies being put on home video, it's no surprise that a lot of Romero's fans came to champion The Crazies as something that should be appreciated for a lot of the same reasons that his Dead movies were. So by the 2000s, with horror remake fever truly setting in, and Romero once again back in favor thanks to zombies having a new wave of popularity, studios became interested in remaking The Crazies. At first developed by Paramount in 2004, the Crazies remake was set to be written by Scott Kozar and directed by Brad Anderson, who made The Machinist together. But when creative differences caused issues, the film was rewritten by Ray Wright and directed by Breeck Eisner for Rogue Pictures and Overture Films.
No expression, and I find it kind of funny.
He's got it.
You don't know that.
It's okay, I'm not sick! Dreams in which I'm dying.
Oh my God.
Now, laying it all out there like that, with a list of studios and creators that make you say, who? It's not a surprise that this version of the Crazies hasn't been championed by big studios and fancy re-releases, but damn, this thing's awesome. And while it might be heresy to say this, because everybody loves George Romero and his ideas, I gotta say that the 2010 version of the Crazies is way better than Romero's. Of course, you can't have this movie and its ideas without Romero's version, but this is just a much more effective, thrilling execution of the story. It's a lot closer to a zombie outbreak story than what Romero was doing, with its infected being physically twisted and animalistic due to the Trixie contamination, but its bigger budget, $20 million, which isn't huge but is well used here, and much stronger cast, Timothy Olyphant and Radha Mitchell both having a few low-key horror bangers in their resume, make this all work so much better. Whereas Romero's version spends an equal amount of time with both the townsfolk looking to escape and the government agents trying to find a solution, Eisner's version is all about our small-town heroes, and the government is essentially anonymous and faceless. Here it's Sheriff David Dutton and his wife Judy, a doctor, who discover that their small town of Ogden Marsh has been infected by a military plane that's crashed in a local river. And of course, things go downhill fast when the town is quarantined and the infected populace violently lose their minds. It's flashier, louder, and a lot less subtle than being a thrill ride instead of a social commentary, but I think it works incredibly well. Romero, God bless him, couldn't direct an action scene to save his life, so action and choreography was never really part of his focus. Here, Eisner creates a really chaotic and extremely dangerous legion of Trixie infected, with some awesome action sequences. That's not all. I think that the 2010 version also creates a much more vivid picture of a community ripped apart by infection. By starting further before the quarantine begins, Eisner's film lets the character relationships breathe a little more. It also gives time to return to the town, now completely destroyed, making it all a little more tragic. But the military here is an entirely different beast, and I think it speaks a lot to how much public perception had changed in the decades between these two versions. By the time Romero released his film, the US had just exited the Vietnam War after years and years of heavy losses, and the country becoming jaded about its international presence, involvement in wars, and ability to win in combat. So of course the US military in Romero's version is extremely ineffective. The two main military representatives are well-meaning and are trying to find a solution, but they're ordered about by faceless leaders who don't know what to do and don't care about the impact of their actions. Ultimately, the battle to save Evans City is completely pointless, and the film ends with Watts potentially finding a cure, only to be mistaken for an infected citizen and killed in a stampede, losing the cure forever due to his lack of communication and the chaos of the military operation. And while we know that David is immune, he doesn't bother to help because he's lost all hope in humanity. We end the film with reports of Trixie infection happening in nearby Louisville, with Colonel Peckham choppered out alone in the dark. Everything about to get much worse. It's a pretty bleak ending, bleaker than even I'd say Night of the Living Dead or Dawn of the Dead, because we see the entire system collapse firsthand and know that this is only going to keep happening and keep getting worse. Not for the last time, Romero seems to give up on humanity. In the 2010 version, the military is an even bigger threat than the infected. Now, what's important to remember is that by this point in time, we're on the other side of nearly 40 years of weapons development, massive military operations, and the War on Terror, which saw the US military deploy an insane amount of weaponry and infantry in ways that were heavily documented by the news. So the military that quarantines Ogden Marsh is a huge force that uses heavy weaponry, attack choppers, drone surveillance, and eventually a nuclear bomb. The The fear here is not that the military isn't prepared. It's that it's more dangerous than you could ever imagine, and yet, it's still not enough to stop the spread of Trixie. And honestly, I don't think it's a coincidence that once again, a version of the Crazies was made deep into a never-ending US war, with the military 7 years deep in wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, but with the prospects looking worse than ever. And by the end of the 2010 version, Ogden Marsh has been nuked, and our couple is on their way to Cedar Rapids, with the military about to lock this area down next, and a news broadcast hinting at more destruction. In either case, it's pretty bleak. Whether it's civilians in the military locked in a never-ending cycle of useless fighting, or a small hope that's likely about to be snuffed out, no version of the Crazies is a pleasant experience, and they shouldn't be either. Some horror entertains, some disturbs, some encourages us to be our best selves, and in the case of the Crazies, some despairs over the world that we've made. What you choose to do with that vision of the world may just decide your future. Thanks for watching today's video, and happy Summerween! Over the course of the channel, I have slowly been covering the works of George Romero, including his original Dead trilogy, his sequel Dead trilogy, and Martin. And of course, George Romero is one of those titans of horror, someone who is so influential that I think his ideas and impact often outweigh his actual films, or at least quite a few of them. And in the case of the Crazies, this is a movie that I've always thought was done better in the remake. So when I decided to make this video for Summerween, I really wanted to go back and revisit the original film, try to give it a new look, and unpack a lot of the ideas happening in it. And by the end, I think that the original Crazies by Romero is better than I thought it was when I first saw it, but is still not a great movie, but a very interesting one and with a lot of ideas on its mind. And while the remake of the Crazies is not as socially conscious, I think that it's a much better made film, is a lot more enjoyable, and is a lot more what I think modern horror fans are looking for in a film with this sort of idea. There are a lot of parallels to the Living Dead movies, but I think this has its own ideas, its own execution, and is really speaking to Vietnam. Whereas I think that the Living Dead movies are more talking about US society as a whole. Still, I think that this is a really interesting film to unpack, and I hope that you enjoy this trip through both versions of the Crazies. I'd love to hear your thoughts on these two movies, your own personal favorite George Romero movies, and other Romero movies that you'd like to see me cover in the future. As always, a huge thank you to my patrons and members for their continued support, and if you'd like to be a member or patron, it's only $2 a month for early access to every video and exclusive reviews. So until next time, I hope that you're taking care of yourselves and having a happy Summerween.